Hello everyone. Today's video is going to be a little bit different than usual. My friend, Steve Szabo, recently introduced me to his friend, Stephen Wallace. Now, as you know, if you've seen my video, which I will link here, you will know that I had an experience involving Padre Pio. Well, Stephen Wallace also had an experience involving Padre Pio, and he's never had his story recorded. So we decided to sit down in a group and just let Stephen Wallace tell his story. So without further ado, here's Stephen Wallace telling the story of his miraculous recovery from a near fatal condition and intercessory prayers that involved Padre Pio.
Yeah, I'll do a quick introduction if you can hear me. My name is
Okay.
Steve Szabo, and I'm a friend of Josh's. We met online and been talking about Christianity and supernatural things, and Padre Pio he mentioned, and remembered that I knew Stephen Wallace here, who had some thing to say about Padre Pio. So that's
Yeah.
about me and all I have to say. Maybe you guys.
Yes, and my name is Stephen Wallace. I work for the Knights of Columbus, so that's how I met Steve Sabo. And in our one of our meetings, I mentioned, uh, as you can see behind me, if you can see behind me, there's a painting of Padre Pio, and so we just had a discussion on why Padre Pio was in my office, and then Steve contacted me about meeting Joshua. So I'm here. I'm here for that reason.
Yeah, so I'm always excited to hear any supernatural stories at this point. So I would love to hear your story, Stephen.
Yeah. Well, in May 31st, 2002, my wife had to rush me to the hospital because I was basically unconscious and my skin was turning green. She didn't know what was going on with me. When I got to the doctor's office, which was at the hospital, uh, he took one look at me and realized that I was going septic from something. And so they did a CAT scan on my abdomen and realized they thought my appendix had ruptured. But when they did surgery, they found out quickly it was my colon and not my appendix. And
Okay.
so it took them a few hours to kind of get me through that surgery, clean out the stuff that was making me sick all of. And a few hours later, I was in recovery still, and the doctor told my wife, we think Steve's gonna pull through this. He's young. I was 29 years old at the time, and he said, but there's like a 5% chance that he might go into a septic shock or whatever. And so I did. I ended up going into a coma. It's while I was in that coma that I've got some recollection of things that can only be used the word supernatural. Um, I like to say supernatural and miracle kind of coexist on the same plane of things. And so, uh, something happened. I didn't realize what had happened till I woke up from the coma. Uh, I was on a tracheotomy, so I couldn't talk. And then after about a week, they started screwing some kind of valve into my trachea site that acted as my voice box. And so my brother and wife, who basically stayed at the hospital or today when I was in this coma, they thought I was gonna pull through at the time. Um, they would ask me things like, "What do you remember from being in the coma?" Uh, so they would ask me these stories, and I would tell them stories that I they thought were funny. Well, one day, my wife was really impressed with me. Like, do you remember anything else that maybe isn't funny? I said, well, I do remember one day I was talking with Obi-Wan Kenobi, and I'm a big Star Wars fan, as you can see on my wall back there. I got some
Yeah.
lightsabers and stuff. But I said, yeah, I was talking to Obi-Wan Kenobi. We were on Tatooine, the planet he and Luke lived on, and we were like, I guess in a cave or maybe it was his room, and we were just talking. And she goes, well, what were y'all talking about? And I said, well, I have no clue. I don't remember what we were talking about, but I can remember looking at his face. I could see his mouth moving. I can feel my jaw moving, talking back to him, but the words elude me right now. And still to this day, I have no clue what me and Obi-Wan were talking about. Well, uh, she asked me to tell her what Obi-Wan looked like. So I said, he had like on the brown robe that he wears, and he had the hood and the gray beard. The whole time I'm describing Obi-Wan, I'm thinking like the guy from the movie, Ben Kingsley from the movies.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the guy that I'm thinking I'm sitting there with. I didn't know this. On the outside of my hospital bed was a prayer card, a Padre Pio prayer card. And on the picture on the prayer card was Padre Pio with his brown robe on, with his gray beard, with his stigmata, bandaged hands and stuff. And so I'm telling her what this guy Obi-Wan looked like. The whole time I'm telling her, she's not looking at me talking. She's looking at this prayer card that's on the other side of my bed rail.
At this point, had you seen the prayer card?
No, that's why I'm
Okay.
emphasizing that the prayer card was on the outside of my hospital bed. And I hadn't been out of this hospital bed ever. So I had never seen this prayer card. I had never heard of Padre Pio. My wife and I were both, we went to church every Sunday. We kind of studied the catechism. We were enrolling our young daughters in Sunday school or whatever they called it at that church in Texas. But I said what that meant is we really adhered to the teachings of the church in most aspects of our lives. So I'd never heard of Padre Pio, and to my knowledge, neither had she. But when I was in a coma, and I have no clue what this couple's name is. I'm sure my wife knows who they are. But when they were at the waiting room of the hospital in the ICU, they told Mary, that's my wife, that they were praying for the intercession of Padre Pio for my healing. And Mary didn't know, well, who's Padre Pio? And so they told her a little bit about this guy, that he was, he was canonized. He was a blessed Padre Pio at the time. And so here I'm in the coma. They give her a prayer card, tell her they're invoking his prayers for my healing. She tapes it to the outside of my hospital bed. I then, in my coma, at some point have a time where I'm talking with Obi-Wan Kenobi. And when I'm telling my wife this story, she goes, Steve, could it possibly be that you weren't talking to Obi-Wan Kenobi? And I said, who else would it have been? He's the only guy I know who looks like that guy on my wall. And she pulls the prayer card off the bed and says, now I want you to look at this and have an open mind. So she turns the prayer card around, and that's the guy that I remembered seeing that I thought was Obi-Wan Kenobi. It was Padre Pio. So the whole time I'm thinking it's Obi-Wan Kenobi. I'm waiting for like a lightsaber to come out. It's really Padre Pio, which is, in my life, even better than meeting Obi-Wan Kenobi. I am out of the coma. I'm released from the hospital, but I go back every day on this little bus back to a program at the hospital for stroke patients to do rehabilitation. So I'm learning how to walk, talk, dress myself. I'm learning all this stuff like in a day program. I'm the youngest person in the program. I'm 30. The other people are like 75, 80 years old. I started bringing a book to practice reading and trying to concentrate. And one of the books I brought to this therapy program was one of the biographies of Padre Pio. His childhood, how his parents thought he was kind of weird, and as a youngster he was in the army and all this kind of stuff. And then he became a priest, and then his priestly ministry somehow got a bad rap, and so the Vatican silenced him for a while.
Yeah.
And then he was able to get back in the good graces and be allowed to practice his priestly ministries. But in reading this biography, they talked about his ability to hear confessions, and how he would sometimes sit there for 12 hours a day hearing confessions, and the line to get in to see him was like down the block and up the street and all this kind of stuff. And there were even some stories about his ability to bilocate, be in two places at the same time, and maybe even hear confessions during both of those times.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really got on my heart through prayer and meditation that I think what was going on when we were sitting in this room talking, in this cave, is that he was hearing my deathbed confession. Because here I am in a coma. I'm like probably worse than 50-50 whether I'm live or die. I'm so septic.
And you were 29 at this point, you said?
I was 29.
Okay.
And according to my wife, I had more medicine than blood in my system. They were just pumping me with all kinds of stuff, trying to get me back to life.
Right.
All my organs were shutting down, so they were giving me medicine to preserve my organs, so that if I did come back, the organs would still be there. I was on dialysis, I had blood transfusions, all this stuff that I don't even like to think about now, but it's there. And so, but now my mind is thinking, well, I'm past all that. I'm alive, and now I kind of want to know why I'm alive. And so thinking back to this time I spent with Padre Pio, and I believe in my heart it was 100% time with Padre Pio. I figured that he was sharing my deathbed confession in this cave, and then once he absolved me from the sins, and then he brought my prayer to Jesus, I was somehow healed enough to get out of this coma and start progressing towards I hate to say normalcy, because I don't think I've even there yet 23 years later.
Mm-hmm.
But I was heading back to the living. I was no longer with the dead people in my coma. I really believe that the spiritual healing I got from that confession with Padre Pio is what allowed my physical healing to get started. I've never been blessed with the knowledge of our conversation, so I don't know what was said. But and knowing a bit about the sacrament of confession, I believe that when you confess your sins to the priest and to God, if they're forgiven and absolved, you don't have to know what those sins were anymore. You just don't want to commit them again, or we try our best not to commit those sins again. And so I really think that God has taken the knowledge of that conversation away from me, because the details of the conversation aren't the important aspect of it. The important aspect is that the conversation was had, and that I confessed those sins, and they were forgiven.
Can you tell us about how miraculous the healing might have been? I thought you might have mentioned some more about that. What was your prognosis?
When they did the emergency surgery, the doctor, when I was in recovery, told my wife there's a better than 50% chance I'll recover from this, and there will be no effects. But then I went into the coma, so that kind of changed the ball game. Because when I was in the coma, I had 2 different respiratory arrests. One time my heart stopped for 45 seconds.
Wow.
So there was no oxygen being circulated. The next time, my heart stopped for 1 minute 20 seconds.
Wow.
So my brain did undergo some oxygen deprivation during this coma. And the other thing during the coma was my fever continued to rise from the infection. I basically had E. coli infections from my colon eruption. And so my fever got up to 108, and it was that way for a couple of hours. So the hospital, packed me in ice and tried to do what they could to bring my temperature down. So when I came out of the coma and they realized I was having, some muscular deficits, that I had trouble like walking, balance. Still to this day, manipulating small objects with my fingers is difficult. I try not to do it. So when I was in the coma, the doctors told my wife that they gave me a 50-50 chance of survival, but they told her if I did survive, it was most likely that I would have severe brain damage. And so my wife was like, well, we want him to wake up and see what happens from there.
And this was primarily because of the multiple times that your heart had stopped, right? And so they were just
Yeah,
worried
it was
that...
mostly due to the oxygen deprivation and the fever. I think that high fever may have touched my brain stem. And
The only other person I've heard of getting that high is actually Padre Pio.
yeah, maybe. The hospital told my wife I was the highest fever they have ever had at that hospital.
Oh,
I
wow.
assume in 23 years it's probably still the highest. Maybe there's a plaque for me on the wall for highest fever. I don't know.
like a Hall of Fame.
Yeah, fever.
Did
Hall
the
of Fame.
doctors say anything else about your recovery since the original 50-50 prognosis?
Well, once I woke up, obviously, whether I'm gonna wake up is now 100%, but they still weren't sure how much of my mental state and my ability to do things was gonna get back to normal. So I started really intensive physical, occupational, and speech therapy. And I had a ton of self doubts during all this time, because here I was a healthy, I mean, I was a little overweight, but I was a 29-year-old. I would go to the Y and play basketball with my friends and lift weights occasionally. And I did things. I was not like the couch potato I am today. Back then, I used to be very active doing things. When I started physical therapy and I couldn't stand on my own, I was in a wheelchair, and the physical therapists were having their doubts. And I don't know if the doubts were because of where I was actually at physically and medically. I think it was doubts because my mindset was just not good. I started thinking back to if there was something about me that allowed Padre Pio to come visit me in a coma. There's got to be something about me that will allow me to get back to being a productive citizen again. And so, Padre Pio was there for me spiritually, but I think I've been able to look at that event and say, if I'm worthy of that, then I'm worthy of so much more. I should be able to walk down the street if I want to. I should be able to climb on the roof if I really want to, hang Christmas lights or something. So I started working to get better in physical therapy, not just pass the time. And so I think that event motivated my healing for the last 23 years. I oftentimes look to Padre Pio for some inspiration. And that's another reason he's on my office wall, is that he a lot of times I'll sit there and meditate and pray with Padre Pio and come out of that kind of rejuvenated to get back to my job. And so that one experience has really stuck with me for the rest of my life so far.
Yeah, so did the doctors say that afterwards? Did they have some commentary with the follow-ups about?
They were always amazed that I was getting better. like I was improving by leaps and bounds over what they thought I would. Uh, the my surgeon, and during this recovery, kept in touch with my wife even after his part was done, and I was on to like an internist and physical therapist and all that stuff. He was still keeping track of me, and he mentioned just kind of off the cuff one day to Mary. He didn't tell me this to my face, but he told her that we're so happy that he's getting better and able to do things again. I wasn't driving yet. I think I was still walking with a cane, but he mentioned to her off the cuff one day, well, I think Steve will get back to being normal, but he'll probably never run a marathon. And Mary said, well, that's no big deal. He never ran marathons to begin with. But then she came home and told me what the surgeon said. And so I put it in my head. I said, I'm going to run a marathon and show them. And I did. In December of 2010, so this was 8 years after, I ran a marathon. I was really slow, but I finished. And to this day, I say, heck, here I am, a guy that couldn't walk 8 years ago, and I just finished this marathon in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It actually snowed on the day of our race. It never snows in Baton Rouge, so it was just like these things keep happening, that little signs that say you're doing what I want you to do, and I think God's happy with the way I've been able to do things.
Yeah, there's so many times where I have the same thing where I'll be like, the little signs, those little hints that you're on the right path, right? And then sometimes they've been like super crazy, and other times they're like more gentle hints,
Right.
But you just get something that lets you know, okay, you're heading the right direction. You're right where I want you right now.
Yeah. I get those all the time. I mean, and they're really good. It's sometimes I've been guilty of not like seeing them in the moment that they've happened, but like a day or a week later, I'll reflect on that event and say, you know what, that was a sign. Why didn't I catch that when it was there? I always have felt like maybe I wasn't supposed to catch it that day. Maybe it means more to me now than it would have the day that happened.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah.
I can't help but notice there's some similarities. I don't know if you've seen my video yet. It was interesting that both of us didn't know who he was when it happened.
Yeah.
Which I find fascinating.
Yeah, you probably had somebody praying for you, I think, like Stephen did.
Possibly. In my case, I do not remember a single connection to anybody in the Catholic Church growing up at all. I mean, so I don't know who that would have been.
Yeah.
If that were the case. But
it's on. One thing I did forget to mention, the day I woke up from my coma, which would have been after I had this meeting with Padre Pio, was June 16th, 2002, which if you look at your calendar, that was Father's Day that year.
Oh.
But the other important thing for that day, that year, was the day that Padre Pio was canonized as a saint in the Vatican. So the day I woke up was Father's Day, and it was his day of becoming a saint, canonization. But then I'm realizing that Padre Pio was such a force in my healing, and to think that the day that I officially woke up from this coma was the day he was officially canonized. In my mind, that means that there's something really convergent about that day, that that was supposed to be my day to wake up. It was supposed to be his day to be canonized, and somehow those things are tied together.
Yeah.
So that's I think Padre Pio's feast day is in September every year, September 21st maybe. Yeah. But my family really celebrates June 16th as the day he was canonized, and the day I woke up. That's got a little bit more emphasis for us, but we still look at it. His feast day is that's a pretty important day.
Yeah. Very cool. This is a fantastic story. Thank you for sharing everything.
Oh, thank you for
Yeah,
allowing me to share it.
yeah, for sure. And what do you think is the most important spiritual lesson you've learned from this whole experience?
I think, even though I would describe myself as a good Catholic going into that, I think the story of doubting Thomas, to be taught a faith lesson is one thing, but actually live through a faith lesson is totally different. So now I could see with my own eyes. And so that is similar in my mind to Jesus showing Thomas the wounds of his hands and saying, "Put your finger in this wound."
Right.
And so I think the faith lesson for me is that seeing is believing, but you don't have to see to believe. For me, it goes back to that cave with Padre Pio being standing there right in front of me and talking to me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing it, Steve.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is great.
You're
Video.
welcome, and thank you guys for having me on to talk about this stuff.